In 1978, China was a nation of peasants, its people living in desperate poverty with foreign investment nearly non-existent. The country had closed its doors to the outside world for decades, its shelves bare, and ambition a crime against the collective. But then, one man, standing just 5 feet tall, changed everything. Banished twice from power and nearly executed by his own government. His name, Deng Xiaoping. He wasn't a visionary. He wasn't a charismatic revolutionary. He was a survivor. On the 22nd of August 1904, in a small village called Paifang, nestled deep within the red-earthed hills of Sichuan province in southwestern China, a boy was born into a family of middling prosperity. His given name was Deng Xiaoping. He would not become Deng Xiaoping, meaning little peace, until years later. But even in childhood, there were signs of the steely, curious mind that would one day reshape a civilization. Sichuan in 1904 was a world apart from the political tremors shaking the rest of China. The Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty in Chinese history, was entering its final, exhausted decades. Empress Dowager Cixi, the formidable woman who had effectively ruled China for nearly half a century, still sat behind her silk screen in Beijing, increasingly unable to hold together a crumbling empire. Foreign powers carved concession zones from Chinese cities. Boxer, rebellion, veterans nursed their wounds and hatreds. If this documentary resonated with you, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your engagement truly helps this channel grow, ensuring we continue to bring impactful stories to you. Thank you for your support. Reformers whispered dangerous ideas about constitutions, republics, and national pride. But in Paifang, the rhythms of life moved to older clocks. The Deng family occupied a position that historians describe as landlord class, not fabulously wealthy, but educated and locally influential. Deng's father, Deng Wenming, was literate, politically engaged, and ambitious for his son. He insisted the boy receive a proper education, at a time when most Chinese children did not. It was a fateful decision. Young Deng attended a modern, Western-influenced primary school, an institution that blended Confucian tradition with newer ideas about science, mathematics, and civic duty. He was a sharp, quick student, but the world outside the schoolroom was transforming faster than any curriculum could capture. In 1911, when Deng was just 7 years old, the Qing dynasty collapsed. Sun Yat-sen proclaimed the Republic of China. For a generation of young Chinese minds, the fall of the empire was both terrifying and intoxicating. The sense that the entire order of things was suddenly negotiable, that history itself was raw and unformed, waiting to be shaped by whoever had the courage and intelligence to reach out and grasp it. Deng was 16 years old when he made the decision that would define his life. He applied to join a work-study program in France, an initiative designed to expose promising young Chinese students to European industrial society, while allowing them to earn money through factory labor. It was a radical choice. Most boys from families like his would have sought a comfortable bureaucratic post or a teaching position. Deng chose to travel 13,000 miles to a country whose language he did not yet speak, to work in factories alongside strangers, and to learn whatever the world had to teach him. In the autumn of 1920, the 16-year-old Deng Xiaoping boarded a ship in Shanghai and sailed west. He would not return to China for 5 years. When he came back, he would be an entirely different person. France in the early 1920s was a nation still bleeding from the wounds of the Great War. The factories where Deng worked in Bayeux, in Montargis, in the steelworks of Le Creusot, were grim, clanging places, thick with the smell of machine oil and the exhaustion of men ground down by industrial capitalism at its most unsparing. Deng worked 12-hour shifts. He ate cheap food. He slept in cramped workers' dormitories. He was often cold. And he read everything he could find. In the circles of Chinese students scattered across France, a political ferment was developing. Young men, far from home, experiencing the indignities of colonial assumptions and factory exploitation, were hungry for explanations and solutions. Marxist literature circulated hand to hand. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had sent electric shockwaves through leftist movements worldwide. The idea that workers, the very people Deng labored alongside every day, could seize control of their own destiny was not merely theoretical. It had happened. Lenin had proved it possible. In 1922, Deng joined the European branch of the Chinese Communist Youth League. He was 18 years old. He had found his cause. And more importantly, he had found his method: practical, disciplined, patient organization. Less romantic idealism, more grinding, unglamorous work. He also met in those Parisian circles a young man named Zhou Enlai, elegant, articulate, and possessed of a political grace that Deng entirely lacked but deeply admired. The two men would form a bond that endured for more than 50 years, through purges, triumphs, exile, and revolution. Zhou Enlai would one day be Deng's most important protector. But in those early Parisian days, they were simply two poor Chinese students arguing about Marxism over cheap wine and cheaper bread. After France, Deng spent nearly a year in the Soviet Union, studying at the Communist University of the Toilers of the East in Moscow. He absorbed the Leninist model of party organization, the iron discipline, the democratic centralism, the belief in a vanguard elite leading the masses toward historical inevitability. He returned to China in 1927, hardened by experience, radicalized by injustice, and carrying a set of political tools he would use and refine for the rest of his life. China in the late 1920s was a nation at war with itself. The Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, had turned savagely against its former communist allies in the Shanghai Massacre of 1927, slaughtering thousands of party members and labor organizers in a single week of orchestrated violence. Deng, who had arrived back in China just months before, found himself suddenly part of an underground movement hunted by the government. For the next 2 decades, Deng lived the life of a revolutionary. He organized peasant uprisings in Guangxi province. He engaged in guerrilla warfare in the mountainous borderlands of Jiangxi and Fujian. He survived factional struggles within the Communist Party itself, no small feat, in an organization where ideological disputes had a way of becoming fatal. In 1934, facing annihilation by nationalist forces, the Red Army undertook what would become the most celebrated military retreat in Chinese history, the Long March. Over 370 days, approximately 80,000 to 100,000 communist soldiers marched more than 9,000 kilometers through some of China's most forbidding terrains: snow-capped mountains, treacherous marshes, regions so remote that no army had ever attempted to cross them. Disease, starvation, enemy attacks, and sheer exhaustion killed the vast majority. Fewer than 8,000 of those who started the march survived to finish it. Deng Xiaoping survived. And not merely survived, he was part of the inner core that emerged from the Long March with their authority consolidated and their revolutionary credentials permanently established. The experience was the Communist Party's foundational myth, its valley of the shadow of death, the ordeal that separated the committed from the merely curious. When Japan launched its full-scale invasion of China in 1937, the Communist-Nationalist Civil War entered a temporary, uneasy suspension. Deng served as a political commissar with the 8th Route Army, one of the communist forces nominally integrated into the nationalist military structure for the duration of the war against Japan. As a commissar, he was responsible for maintaining ideological discipline, morale, and the political loyalty of the troops under his supervision. It was administrative, organizational work, unglamorous, essential, and deeply revealing of Deng's particular genius. He was not a brilliant battlefield tactician in the style of Lin Biao or Peng Dehuai. He was something more durable, a superb political organizer who understood how to build institutions, maintain supply chains of loyalty and resources, and make the grinding machinery of a large organization actually function. These were not exciting qualities. They were indispensable ones. After Japan's defeat in 1945, the Civil War resumed. By 1949, the Communist forces had swept the nationalist government from the mainland and across the Taiwan Strait. On October 1st, 1949, standing in Tiananmen Square before a crowd of hundreds of thousands, Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. Deng Xiaoping was 45 years old. He had been a revolutionary for more than 2 decades. Now, at last, the revolution had won. In the first decade of the People's Republic, Deng rose with remarkable speed. He served as vice premier. In 1956, he became General Secretary of the Communist Party, effectively the head of the party's day-to-day administrative operations. He was, by any reasonable measure, the second or third most powerful man in China. He was also, increasingly, someone who said quiet, uncomfortable things. In 1956, Mao launched the 100 Flowers campaign, an ostensible invitation for intellectuals to freely criticize the party. Deng was skeptical from the beginning. When the campaign revealed the depth of popular resentment toward communist rule and was abruptly reversed into the anti-rightist campaign, in which more than 500,000 people were labeled rightists and sent to labor camps or had their lives destroyed, Deng administered the purge with his characteristic efficiency. He was not a man who resisted orders he disagreed with. He was a man who survived by making himself useful, and then waited. The waiting was about to become very long indeed. Between 1958 and 1962, Mao Zedong launched the Great Leap Forward, an attempt to transform China from an agrarian economy into a modern industrial socialist society in a matter of years. It was one of the most catastrophically misguided economic programs in human history. Peasants were organized into vast communes, stripped of private plots, and ordered to abandon farming in favor of crude backyard steel production. Agricultural knowledge accumulated over centuries was discarded. Harvests rotted in fields. Food was taken from villages to meet fabricated production quotas. Local officials, terrified of being purged for reporting failure, reported impossible successes. The result was the Great Chinese Famine, the deadliest in human history. Between 1959 and 1961, historians estimate that between 15 and 55 million people died of starvation. The range of uncertainty is itself staggering. The true number may never be precisely known, because the records were suppressed and many remain inaccessible to this day. Deng Xiaoping saw the disaster clearly. In internal party discussions, he was among those who pushed for a pragmatic retreat from the Great Leap's excesses, allowing peasants to farm small private plots, restoring market incentives, acknowledging that ideology alone could not grow food. It was at this time that he reportedly made the statement that would become the defining slogan of his later career. It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice. What mattered was results. What mattered was whether people had enough to eat. Mao heard these pragmatic arguments. He seethed. In 1966, Mao Zedong, fearing that the revolution was being bureaucratized and betrayed by precisely the kind of pragmatic party officials that Deng represented, unleashed the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. It was an act of extraordinary political violence disguised as ideological renewal. Universities were closed. Professors, doctors, and intellectuals were sent to the countryside for re-education through manual labor. Museums and temples were ransacked. Ancient artworks were smashed. The past itself was declared an enemy. And the Red Guards, young, fervent, terrifying, marched through the streets with their little red books of Mao's quotations, denouncing anyone identified as a counter-revolutionary, a capitalist rhoder, a defender of bourgeois values. The targets were often whoever a local faction disliked. The system was chaos weaponized. Deng Xiaoping was labeled in the official propaganda of the Cultural Revolution, the number 2 person in authority taking the capitalist road. Number 1 was Liu Shaoqi, the president of China, who would die in captivity, denied medicine and basic care, in 1969. Deng was publicly humiliated, forced to bow before jeering crowds, forced to wear a dunce cap. His eldest son, Deng Pufang, was thrown from a building by Red Guards, whether pushed or forced to jump is still disputed, and was left permanently paralyzed from the waist down. Deng and his wife were sent to work at a tractor repair factory in Jiangxi province. For more than 3 years, the former General Secretary of the Communist Party of China spent his days sweeping floors and repairing machinery. He was 63 years old. In the evenings, confined to a small house under surveillance, he walked circles in the courtyard, reportedly covering several miles a day. He read, he thought, he waited. Years later, when asked how he survived the Cultural Revolution, Deng gave a characteristically brief answer. I tried not to think about it. It was either the profoundest stoicism or the profoundest denial, or perhaps, in someone of his temperament, they were the same thing. By 1973, the worst of the Cultural Revolution's violence had exhausted itself. China faced a series of practical crises: diplomatic isolation, economic stagnation, a deteriorating relationship with the Soviet Union that demanded competent administrators rather than ideological crusaders. Zhou Enlai, Deng's old friend from the Paris days, was now premier and was himself fighting cancer. He needed help. He asked for Deng. In 1973, Deng Xiaoping was formally rehabilitated and returned to Beijing. He was appointed vice premier. He threw himself back into work with the ferocity of a man who understood that every day of productive activity was a gift he had not expected to receive. He worked on restructuring the military. He represented China in international forums. He met with foreign leaders. He was, by almost universal acknowledgement, the most capable administrator in the Chinese government. Then Mao turned on him again. In 1975, as Mao's health declined, and the radical faction known as the Gang of Four, led by Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, maneuvered for succession, they identified Deng as their chief obstacle. He was accused of attempting to reverse the verdicts of the Cultural Revolution, of revisionism, of all the old familiar sins. In early 1976, he was stripped of all his positions and sent into internal exile for the second time. He was 71 years old. Most men would have surrendered. Most men would have concluded that history had passed them by. On the 9th of September 1976, Mao Zedong died. He was 82 years old. He had ruled China for 27 years. He had overseen, with varying degrees of intentionality, the deaths of tens of millions of his own citizens through famine, political violence, and the catastrophic mismanagement of an economy and society of incomprehensible scale. He had also unified a fractured nation, driven foreign imperialism from Chinese soil, and built a state of genuine military and political weight on the world stage. The complexity of his legacy was, and remains, almost impossible to fully resolve. Within weeks of Mao's death, the Gang of Four, the radical clique that had championed the Cultural Revolution and now sought to inherit Mao's mantle, was arrested by Hua Guofeng, Mao's chosen successor. The arrest was accompanied by a popular exhalation of relief so widespread and spontaneous that it amounted to a collective judgment on the previous decade of terror. People wept in the streets, not for the fallen radicals, for the end of fear. Deng Xiaoping was rehabilitated for the second time in 1977. He returned to Beijing to a reception that, by the standards of a one-party state, accustomed to careful political theater, was genuinely warm. Party veterans who had survived the Cultural Revolution were hungry for leadership that prioritized competence over ideology. Deng, despite his age, he was now 73, radiated exactly that. In December 1978, the Communist Party of China held the third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee. It was, in the language of Chinese communist politics, a mouthful. In the language of world history, it was a turning point. Deng Xiaoping had maneuvered skillfully in the 2 years since his rehabilitation, building alliances, outflanking rivals, and carefully preparing the ground for a fundamental shift in Chinese economic policy. Now, at this pivotal meeting, he made his move. The party approved what would become known as Reform and Opening Up Gauge Kaifang. The phrase was deliberately mild, almost bureaucratic. Its implications were revolutionary. The reforms began in agriculture. In a country where 80% of the population still worked the land, the decision to restore private incentives to farming was not merely economic policy, it was a transformation of daily life for hundreds of millions of people. The commune system was effectively dissolved. Peasant families were given long-term leases on plots of land. They were permitted to sell surplus production at market prices. For the first time in a generation, a Chinese farmer could work harder and become materially better off as a direct result. The results were immediate and stunning. Between 1978 and 1984, agricultural productivity in China increased by more than 40%. Rural incomes more than doubled. The threat of famine, which had haunted China for centuries and had killed tens of millions within living memory, began, for the first time, to genuinely recede. Agriculture was only the beginning. In 1980, Deng approved the establishment of 4 special economic zones designated areas, primarily along China's southern coast, where foreign investment would be welcomed, market mechanisms would be permitted, and the regulations that stifled economic activity elsewhere in China would be relaxed or suspended entirely. The first and most famous was Shenzhen, a small fishing town of perhaps 30,000 people directly across the border from Hong Kong. In 1980, it was a muddy backwater. Within a decade, it would become a city of 3 million. Within 2 decades, a global manufacturing hub of 12 million. Today, Shenzhen is home to some of the world's most innovative technology companies, Huawei, Tencent, DJI, and its skyline rivals Manhattan. The transformation of Shenzhen was not magic. It was the result of a deliberate policy choice, consistently applied and insulated from ideological interference. Allow people to keep the rewards of their own labor and enterprise. The entrepreneurs who poured into Shenzhen in the early 1980s were not foreign capitalists alone. They were Chinese men and women who had spent their entire adult lives in a system that punished individual initiative, and who now, given the slightest opening, demonstrated an appetite for commerce and self-improvement that no ideology could ultimately contain. Deng visited Shenzhen in 1984 and reportedly said little, but what he saw clearly confirmed his convictions. The experiment was working. The zones were expanded. The policy was deepened. No honest account of Deng Xiaoping's legacy can avoid the events of June 1989. To attempt to do so would be a failure of historical integrity and, more importantly, a failure of basic human decency to those who suffered. In the spring of 1989, hundreds of thousands of students, workers, and intellectuals gathered in Tiananmen Square in Beijing and in dozens of other Chinese cities to demand political reforms, greater press freedom, and accountability for corruption. The movement was, by most accounts, politically diverse and organizationally chaotic. It was not a movement to overthrow the Communist Party. Many of its participants, in fact, explicitly affirmed their support for socialism. They wanted dialogue. They wanted to be heard. The response of the Chinese leadership, and specifically of Deng Xiaoping, was the declaration of martial law. And, on the night of June 3rd and the morning of June 4th, the deployment of military forces, including tanks, into Beijing. The precise death toll of what followed has never been officially established. Estimates from credible sources range from several hundred to several thousand. The true number remains unknown, because the Chinese government has never permitted an independent investigation. For Deng Xiaoping, the decision to use force appears to have been made with the cold clarity that characterized all his most consequential choices. He believed and said so explicitly to party elders that political instability would derail economic reform, that without order there could be no development, and that the fate of China's transformation was more important than the demands of the protesters. Whether one accepts this reasoning or rejects it with horror, it was entirely consistent with the man he had always been. Someone who subordinated all other values to the pragmatic achievement of material improvement for the largest possible number of people. It was also, in the view of many historians, and of the survivors and families of those who died, a catastrophic moral failure, the moment when the man who had liberated China's economy revealed the iron limits of his vision of freedom. Deng Xiaoping gave China prosperity. He never gave it democracy. By the early 1990s, the reform program had stalled. The political shock of Tiananmen and the subsequent conservative backlash within the party had produced a climate of caution. Officials who had moved quickly to embrace market mechanisms now moved slowly. Foreign investors hesitated. The momentum that had driven a decade of remarkable growth was losing energy. Deng Xiaoping, now 87 years old, officially retired from his last formal position, moved. In January and February of 1992, he undertook what became known as the Southern Tour, a journey through the special economic zones of Guangdong province and the booming cities of southern China. He was not officially in power. He had no formal position that entitled him to make policy. He was, by the standards of conventional political analysis, a private citizen. He didn't care. He was Deng Xiaoping. At stop after stop, he made speeches. He praised the zones. He praised the entrepreneurs. He attacked the cautious conservatives who had slowed the reforms. He insisted that China's path was correct and that the pace of change was not fast enough. To get rich is glorious. He reportedly proclaimed, or at least endorsed, since the precise origins of the phrase are disputed. The message was unmistakable and electrifying. The reform program was not a temporary concession to economic reality. It was the future, all of it. The Southern Tour broke the logjam. Within months, the conservative faction had been outmaneuvered. Foreign investment flooded back into China. A new wave of coastal development projects received approval. The Shanghai Pudong area, an expanse of mudflats across the river from old Shanghai that Deng had approved for development in 1990, began transforming at a pace that astonished even its designers. The 1990s would become the decade in which China's growth truly became not merely impressive, but world historically extraordinary. It is worth pausing to make concrete what the statistics of China's transformation actually represent in human terms. In 1978, approximately 88% of China's rural population lived below the international poverty line, surviving on less than $1.90 a day in today's terms. By 2015, that figure had fallen to less than 6% in absolute numbers. This means that somewhere between 700 million and 800 million individual human beings, more people than currently live in Europe and North America combined, experienced a fundamental material improvement in their conditions of life. They ate better. They lived longer. Their children survived infancy in larger numbers. They had access to medicine, education, and eventually consumer goods and technologies that their parents could not have imagined. This is, by any reasonable measure, the greatest reduction in human poverty in the history of the world. And while the transformation had many architects, the entrepreneurs, the engineers, the local officials, the farmers who responded to incentives with volcanic energy, it began with one man's insistence, in 1978, that ideology must yield to reality. Deng's opening of China to foreign investment and trade did not merely benefit China, it restructured the entire global economy in ways that are still playing out. The ability of multinational corporations to manufacture goods in China, where labor was cheap, abundant, and disciplined, drove down the price of consumer goods for buyers throughout the world. The television sets, running shoes, electronics, and toys that filled the stores of wealthy nations in the 1980s and 1990s and 2000s were almost universally cheaper, in real terms, than they had been before China's opening. This was, in a literal sense, a gift from Chinese labor to global consumers. At the same time, the manufacturing jobs that migrated to China did not migrate from nowhere. They came largely from the industrial heartlands of the United States, Western Europe, and Japan. The communities that lost those jobs experienced a form of economic devastation, deindustrialization, rising unemployment, the hollowing out of middle-class livelihoods that generated political resentments, whose consequences are still reverberating through democratic politics in the West today. The rise of populist nationalism in the United States and Europe, the collapse of the traditional working-class political coalitions, the rage at globalization, all of it bears, in complex and indirect ways, the fingerprints of the decisions Deng Xiaoping made in 1978. He could not have foreseen these consequences. Almost certainly he would not have changed his decisions if he had. But the historian's obligation is to trace causation wherever it leads, even when it leads to uncomfortable places. To understand what Deng Xiaoping achieved, it helps to look at what was happening elsewhere in the world during the same period. In the 1970s and 1980s, many developing countries were experimenting with different models of economic development. India, which gained independence from Britain in 1947, 2 years before the Communist Revolution in China, pursued a model of state-led industrialization and socialist economics. By 1990, the results were starkly different. China's economy had grown at nearly 10% per year for over a decade. India's had grown at the so-called Hindu rate of growth, of roughly 3.5% annually. The divergence in outcomes for ordinary farmers, workers, and families in each country was enormous. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, attempted its own version of economic reform under Mikhail Gorbachev, glasnost, and perestroika. Unlike Deng, who insisted that economic liberalization must precede and fund political change, Gorbachev pursued political openness alongside economic reform. The result, by 1991, was the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself. Deng watched this from Beijing and reportedly expressed a mixture of sadness and vindication. His sequencing economics first, politics second, maybe later, maybe never, had preserved the party's power. Whether that preservation was a good thing for the Chinese people is a question that history has not yet finished answering. After the southern tour of 1992, Deng Xiaoping gradually withdrew from public life. His health was declining, he was afflicted by Parkinson's disease, and his public appearances became increasingly rare. His last confirmed public appearance was during the Chinese New Year celebrations of 1994. After that, he was seen only occasionally and fleetingly, a small, frail figure glimpsed through the window of a car or at the edge of a formal photograph. He died on the 19th of February, 1997, at the age of 92. He had survived the Long March, 2 Cultural Revolution purges, decades of factional warfare, and the extraordinary stress of governing the world's most populous nation through one of the most turbulent transformations in human history. He did not live to see Hong Kong's return to Chinese sovereignty, which occurred in July of that year, a milestone he had personally negotiated with British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in 1984, though his role in securing it was the foundation on which the handover rested. His body was cremated, in accordance with Communist Party tradition. His ashes were scattered at sea. He left no tomb, no mausoleum. He had no interest in the theatrical apparatus of individual glorification that, he seems to have felt, was Mao's failing as much as his greatness. Deng Xiaoping's legacy is, in one sense, the China that exists today, a nation of 1.4 billion people with the world's second largest economy, a space program capable of landing rovers on the Moon and Mars, a military that is the second most powerful on Earth, and a standard of living that, while still unequal, and in many respects inadequate, bears essentially no resemblance to the desperate poverty of 1978. He also built a system, a communist party, that retains absolute political control, reinforced by increasingly sophisticated surveillance technology and a degree of nationalist legitimacy purchased by economic success whose long-term durability remains genuinely uncertain. Under his successor Jiang Zemin, and then Hu Jintao, the system appeared to be gradually opening, cautiously, carefully, toward greater plurality. Under the current leader, Xi Jinping, it has moved decisively in the other direction, centralizing power, eliminating term limits, intensifying ideological control, and asserting Chinese interests abroad with a confidence that Deng might have recognized, but with a rhetorical boldness he would likely have considered premature. Xi Jinping has invoked Deng's legacy selectively and strategically. The economic pragmatism, the insistence on China's right to its own developmental path, the rejection of Western liberal democratic models, all of these find echoes in Deng's actual career. But Deng's extreme caution about projecting Chinese power internationally, his insistence that China should hide its capabilities and bide its time, his deep suspicion of personality cults and concentrated individual power, these aspects of his legacy are less often cited. Among historians, economists, political scientists, and ordinary people around the world, the debate about Deng Xiaoping's legacy is far from settled. The questions are genuine and important. Was the economic transformation worth the political cost? Hundreds of millions of people escaped poverty. That is an enormous, concrete, and undeniable good. But those same hundreds of millions of people remain governed by an authoritarian system that restricts their freedom of speech, denies them the right to organize politically, and maintains its power through the threat and occasional exercise of violence. Are prosperity and freedom independent goods, or is freedom ultimately the foundation on which all other goods rest? Thoughtful people disagree. Was Tiananmen the necessary price of stability? Deng believed so. Many of the protesters who survived the crackdown, and the families of those who did not believe the opposite that the Chinese experience, demonstrated precisely that political freedom and economic development are not incompatible, and that it was the government's choice, not any iron historical law, that prevented them from advancing together. Was the system Deng built sustainable? China's extraordinary growth has slowed significantly in recent years. The demographic challenges created by the one-child policy, which Deng oversaw, are now materializing in the form of a rapidly aging population and a shrinking workforce. The property market has shown alarming signs of structural weakness. Youth unemployment has reached concerning levels. The relationship between China and the United States, the two economies whose integration was the engine of global growth for 3 decades, has shifted from interdependence toward rivalry. The answers to these questions will determine whether Deng's transformation was truly durable, or whether it was a magnificent, historically unprecedented, but ultimately incomplete project. Whatever the ultimate verdict of history, certain lessons from Deng Xiaoping's life seem genuinely and broadly applicable. Resilience is not merely psychological. Deng was destroyed twice by political forces vastly more powerful than himself and came back both times. His resilience was not the resilience of wishful optimism or blind faith. It was the resilience of someone who had developed, through decades of experience, a profound understanding of how power actually worked, and who trusted that understanding enough to wait, patiently, for the moment when it could be applied. Pragmatism without principle is dangerous. But pragmatism, combined with clear, humane goals, the reduction of poverty, the improvement of material life, can achieve things that ideological purity never will. Deng's willingness to say, "I don't care what color the cat is," was not cynicism. It was the recognition that the people his policies affected cared far more about having enough to eat than about the ideological purity of the system that fed them. Power without accountability eventually corrupts the mission. This may be the darkest lesson in Deng's legacy. The very qualities that made him effective, the willingness to act decisively, the dismissal of sentiment, the subordination of individual rights to collective outcomes, also made possible the atrocity of June 1989. When no institutional check exists on the power of a small group of men to make decisions affecting hundreds of millions, the risk of catastrophic moral failure is not theoretical. It is, historically, almost inevitable. Imagine him, for a moment, in that Jiangxi courtyard. In the early 1970s, the former General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, wearing a worker's uniform, sweeping the floor of a tractor factory, walking his daily miles in circles on a patch of concrete, no larger than a suburban backyard. He is 67 years old. His son is paralyzed. His career is over. His party has humiliated and destroyed him. And yet, he walks, he waits, he thinks. There is something in this image, something almost mythological in its compression that captures what made Deng Xiaoping historically significant beyond the statistics of growth and poverty reduction. He understood, at the deepest possible level, that the arc of human events is long, and that the people who ultimately shape it are not always the loudest, or the most charismatic, or the most ideologically pure. Sometimes they are simply the ones who survive long enough and clearly enough to act when the moment comes. The moment came for Deng Xiaoping in December 1978, and he acted, and 800 million people ate. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Stay tuned for more exciting tales and updates. Your support means the world. And don't forget to tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?